Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. Is there a rise in racism and Islamophobia? That's the question posed by two recent opinion polls. The first, for the Pew Research Centre, found a rising tide of restrictions on religion spreading across the world between mid-2009 and mid-2010. The second poll by YouGov found more people support stopping immigration or reducing the number of Muslims than support multiculturalism. For comment on these issues, Fabian Martin talked to Ted Cantle, founder and executive chair of the Institute for Community Cohesion.
These reports show that in the UK, attitudes are hardening towards religion and immigration. Why do you think this is?
I think there's a number of reasons why attitudes are hardening towards migrants in general and towards Muslim communities in particular. The impact of globalisation and particularly the rise of the far right who dwell on the fear of anybody that's different from themselves. And they've been stoking up hatred, particularly anti-Muslim hatred, not just in the UK but across Europe. So people are responding, I'm afraid, to that sort of far-right appeal.
What exactly did you mean when you said that multiculturalism is past its sell-by date?
Well, I think multicultural policies in the UK have unfortunately encouraged too much separation and distinctiveness of different groups. They haven't really dwelled on what people have got in common. They haven't really attempted to bring people together. So we have this paradox, really. All societies, all Western societies at least, are becoming more multicultural. That's an inevitable part of globalization. And yet people are rejecting multicultural policies in the sense that they did keep people apart. So I think what people want to see is more what I call interculturalism. They want to see all the different groups much better connected with each other, learning from each other, relating to each other in new ways, and a change in the approach that we've had over the last 4 or 5 decades.
In your opinion, what could the Muslim community do to improve relations in society?
People do live in parallel lives, and I think it's really beholden on all of the separate communities to try and build bridges with other communities, whether that's other faith communities or other ethnic communities or with migrants, to try and get to know them a bit better, to build trust and understanding between all the different groups. And all the research shows that where that happens, a lot of the racism and stereotypes are undermined. And so I really think that communities have to learn to live with each other and relate to each other a lot better than they have in the past.
Won't the government's restrictions of financial support for religious groups just reinforce their sense of isolation from mainstream politics and community?
No, I think it's exactly the opposite, really. What we need to do is to make sure that minority groups, ethnic and faith groups, are part of the mainstream and are not given separate funding so that they can just simply disappear into their own communities with their own community leaders and their own community structures. They need to be given money which draws them into the wider community and which mainstream services are their services as well, where they feel that they are part of the wider community. All the time we keep funding separate organisations. We just promote the idea that everybody's different and create separation. We really now need to bring people together. We're in an era of super diversity. In London, there's over 350 languages. We need to make sure that people can actually learn about each other and relate to each other.
Well, in the studio to discuss these polls are Sabi Dalu, Joint Secretary of Unite Against Fascism, and Murad Qureshi, Labour member of the London Assembly. On the phone, we're joined by Brian Grimm, Director of Cross-National Data at the Pew Research Centre's Forum on Religion and Public Life. Welcome to the programme, everybody. Murad, these polls and say the experience that Britain's just gone through with the Olympics, where multiculturalism was almost on a global platform, don't seem to sit together too well. Do you think the polls are accurate?
I'm a bit confused actually by these polls from what I've read about them because of the powerful message we got from the London Games for the Olympics and the Paralympics. I mean, you've got to remember, we had not just 80,000 people celebrating Mo Farah winning the 5,000 metres on Super Saturday, he actually bent down and prayed, and Mo is abbreviation for Muhammad. His religion was there. It's quite clear, and I didn't see any Brits having any problems celebrating that. So I am perplexed. Maybe the events of the summer haven't been taken up on the polls in the way that they should have done, and there were actually very few people dissenting from it. I can only remember one Tory MP being put in his box for some derogatory comments he made about the opening ceremony. So I think we're in a better place than that the polls acknowledge, but that's not to be complacent. I've always assumed racism is a constant. It may change its form, and particularly in the present context, it's taken a very Islamophobic form. And whether there's upturns or downturns, unfortunately, it's always going to be there.
Okay. Well, let me just bring Brian Grimm in, because Brian, your organisation was one of the people conducting one of the polls that we're talking about. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about the detail of what you found out and where it applied to? This was a cross-national poll, wasn't it?
That's right. This is a larger global study where we looked at 197 countries and territories around the world and assessed them on two scales. One is government restrictions on religion, and social hostilities involving religion. And our findings were that globally, that about 75% of the world's population lives in countries where there are high or very high government restrictions or social hostilities involving religion. And some of the most severe cases occur in countries like Pakistan, throughout the Middle East, also in South Asia. We see a fair amount of hostilities in Nigeria, growing tensions. So in comparison to some of these places, the findings in the United Kingdom, while we saw an uptick, are not as high as in some other regions. Some of the specific factors that we looked at for the United Kingdom seemed to have a substantial uptick in the years before the Olympics. So our study ended at mid-2010, and it covered the period of from mid-2009 to mid-2010. During that period, there was an uptick in sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, which was unknown which way it would go. There had not been too many violent incidents, but there were during that time. There was a spike in anti-Semitic acts throughout the UK that made quite a bit of news, and the justification that people who engaged in these acts was the actions of Israel, and they were used anti-Semitism as a way to express their political dislike of what Israel was doing. We also saw a significant number of anti-Muslim events during that time, ranging from arson at mosques. But we also saw some of the flip side during this time period, where there were some hostilities from some Muslim communities directed at others. Also, the UK government has been monitoring honor killings, and they estimate there are about a dozen of these, and these often happen within Muslim communities. So these were some of the things that we were monitoring. And so when you add these things up into an index, then the UK had some mob violence on the streets that involved religion, sectarian violence, and so it adds up to a lot of categories, but it certainly isn't the intensity that we see in other countries around the world.
Okay.
And again, and just to emphasize that our analysis was based on actual reports of events, not a public opinion poll of people in society, and it ended by mid-2010. That was the end of our period.
Okay, well, I mean, so Sabi, so that gives us at least some basis for reconciling the sort of contradiction that we were talking about at the beginning, because when you hear Brian talk about the scope and the categories that were included in his poll, it's at least it makes it more possible to reconcile that with Murad's picture earlier on.
Yes, and also I would add that in Britain, certainly anyway, that there seems to be a contradiction in sort of suburban and rural areas and more cosmopolitan urban areas. So there are lots of very positive polls that have been conducted in places like London, Leicester, big multicultural populations, Bradford, Birmingham, which show that the vast majority of the population, the entire city, value very much its multicultural nature. And secondly, there was one specifically carried out in Leicester, which showed that Muslims in Leicester, I mean, there's a large concentration of Muslims in Leicester, and a survey there showed that Muslims apparently consider themselves to be British first and second Muslim. And I think that contradicts very much what Ted Cantle was saying, because I don't agree with him. I don't think that there is any tension between multiculturalism and integration. I think that actually they're often counterposed, as, you know, either you can celebrate multiculturalism or you can, and that is somehow flies in the face of an integrated society. I don't actually think that's the case. And if you look at the study that was carried out in Leicester, actually that's a place where, you know, people, you know, there are lots of mosques there. Eid is celebrated, you know, throughout the whole city. You've got banners up in the city. I'm from there, so I know a lot about the place. And they've always had, because of its population, its very diverse population, religious festivals and cultural celebrations like St. Patrick's Day, Pride and so on have always been celebrated by the whole city. And that's actually contributed to a very integrated city where there aren't very much tensions. Their communities do get along well with one another. I think that's because if you allow people to, I don't think there is a policy, as Ted Cantle referred to, of multiculturalism. I think it's simply a reality, and either you can actually deal with that reality and let people celebrate their culture, their faith, practice their faith and culture, and be free to do so, or you're going to have problems. And I think actually allowing people the space to celebrate their identity, their faith, culture, and so on and so forth, means that communities have respect for the country they live in. So therefore, it's not surprising that they feel more patriotic than perhaps Muslims in France, because their country is not, you know, attacking in the same way as, you know, France is, attacking, you know, Muslims and Islam in the form of, you know, banning religious dress and so on.
All right, let's have a bit further look then at that question and whether or not, as Ted Cantle was suggesting, there's a contradiction between multiculturalism and integration. I mean, I guess one thing that's worth commenting on is that this is a kind of you know, short historical attention span, because what's said today about Muslims has been said about Jews, has been said about the Irish before that. Within a generation or so, not automatically and not without struggle, but nevertheless, you know, people who first of all gather together for security in a single, perhaps geographical community, by the time the next generations come along, that's gone, and some other group of people have come in.
And we see that in London. I think, you know, you don't have to look very hard. I mean, for example, it's quite interesting being at the London Assembly. You're seeing the migration of, for example, the Bangladeshi community into Hamlets out to Essex. And I dare say, you know, you'll see Essex boys and girls who are Bengali, Muslim and Essex girls. So there's a multiple of identities, and I think Ted's wrong to think it's one or the other. Definitely. It's actually a combination of identities that kids will move freely between. I've certainly done that as growing up. I have no problems, and many people in London celebrating all the festivities we have. We practically have a New Year celebration every month in London, and let's continue doing that. So I don't think it's one or the other, and I think people are more sophisticated and can see and can move between those various cultures as and when they see fit. I think what you've got to do is realise also that at the same time, you know, that there are certain communities that for economic and social reasons may be more isolated, and I think the best way to encourage them to open up is to give them the space, and I think in time that happens, and I think that's been seen to be successful reasonably in the UK context.
Okay. Brian, let me just, your poll, you know, ran from mid-2009 to mid-2010, so I guess it's just about the period where the first wave of the effects of the global economic crisis will have hit. Do you have any view about whether or not that affected the things that you were studying?
Well, our study didn't look at that in particular, but there are some other studies that look at the relationship between economic conditions and hostilities involving religion. And one of the things that some of these other studies have noted is that when general conditions in a country deteriorate, that it's often, whether it's through economics or through other crises in a country, often religious minorities can bear the brunt of some of the frustrations of the majority. So our study doesn't speak to that directly, but other studies do indicate there is some connection. One other point that I did want to bring up, if I could, is that in our study we also saw an increase in the number of cases where Christians in the UK had difficulty expressing their faith in public. There's 2 before the European Court of Human Rights, right? 4 cases of Christians who were trying to, for instance, wear a cross while at work, and other instances where they've had a hard time also being able to express their faith in the workplace. And one of the findings from our global poll is that all religious groups are facing problems in multiple countries. About 93% of all countries in the world have some harassment of one religious group or another. And so it's not a problem that's faced just by, say, Muslims in the UK or Christians in Iraq, but Muslims in Iraq also face problems, and Christians in the UK also face problems. So I guess you could say it's an unfortunate shared experience of facing problems. And I think that there's a growing realization around the world that religions are sort of in the same boat when it comes to problems they're facing.
So, let me bring you on that. Do you think, well, first of all, on the economic issue, do you feel that perhaps you were directly involved in combating the far right? Are they in some sense benefiting from the economic dislocation that the world crisis has produced?
I would say yes. In the long term, yes. I mean, you can see how the growth of the Golden Dawn in Greece and the highest vote ever for the Front National in France is connected to the austerity measures. I think here in Britain, it's a bit of an anomaly in the sense that actually, technically, the far right is sort of in somewhat of a decline than it has been over the last decade. However, I think that as the impact of the austerity measures and the cuts deepen, because this is just the beginning phase. I mean, the Tories or the coalition government only came into power May 2010, so we're just over 2 years on. It'll get worse in the next sort of decade or so. So I think that I certainly wouldn't be surprised if we saw a resurgence of the far right, and particularly electorally. It's a bit unclear whether the sort of strategy that the English Defence League pursue, its street demonstrations, where that is heading. I mean, there may be some particular event that allows them to grow once more, but their mobilisations are a lot smaller than they have been in the last couple of years. I mean, this year they're sort of only, getting hundreds, less than 500 out on the streets, whereas in 2010 and 11, you were looking at demonstrations of at least 1,000, sometimes 2,000-3,000. So there's been a massive decline. But I wouldn't want to be complacent, because I think that it's precisely this sort of climate that is allowing the far right electorally to grow across Europe, and also historically in the 1930s it was the Great Depression that led to obviously fascists taking power. I mean, I don't think we're in that situation here, but what I think we'd want to avoid in Britain, which is why Unite Against Fascism will continue its campaigning work, is a situation where a fascist organisation becomes powerful enough electorally to be a kingmaker in a situation where no political party has a majority, and therefore can play kingmaker in any coalition deals and so on.
I mean, do you think, Murad, that the continued kind of threat of the far right is, in a sense, it's a kind of phenomena produced by a state-led or establishment-led form of Islamophobia? Because, Brian makes the point that there are, other religions are under threat. No. But I think most of us in this country would say, look, come on, there aren't headline after headline after headline in the popular press carrying on about Christians, but there is about Muslims.
Yes, true. I mean, it's two observations that occur to me. I mean, I actually think there's some parallels to when Margaret Thatcher came into power in 1979, when there was a decisive shift to the right. And in the meantime, the far right broke away. The National Front just became fragmented. And I think we're having a similar thing here with the Tories moving to the right increasingly. I mean, one of their big promises was immigration, a promise that they're going to find themselves unable to maintain and deliver, quite honestly. But nonetheless, that I think has taken represented some of the concerns that some may have had in these circumstances. In the meantime, again, the right has disintegrated, and we should be grateful for that. So I think that you have to look at it across the whole spectrum, not just what's happening in the right. I think in the London context, it's quite clear there's about 5% there, or just above 5%. When they mobilise, they can get someone into the London Assembly, but they're not concentrated enough to win a parliamentary seat, certainly, and can win council seats, but that's if there's a low turnout. And I think that those are the changes I think we've got. With the Pew study, actually, it just got me thinking. You see, I'm someone who, having grown up in London, I only realised I was a Muslim after 9/11. Up until then, no one had asked me that. Now, quite frankly, with a name like mine, Murad Qureshi, it's pretty obvious. And I do think what's happened in recent time is there's been a lot more focus in community affairs on faith, whatever that may be, in particular contexts, and I think it's a global phenomenon as much as here, away from race. And I've always had, personally, difficulties dealing with that. It's meant, for those who have been targeted, like Muslims, through the press and what have you, it's also meant people looking at themselves and saying to themselves, what does it mean to be one? If I'm going to be accused of being one, let me find out. That's one way of responding. Others like me say, well, I've just said, well, what's the big deal? It's obvious. So I do understand where the studies are coming from, and it has become a global phenomenon, and it may take up different forms. I mean, for example, the most sectarian place I've ever been to in Britain has been Northern Ireland, and it seems as though that's going a few steps backwards when we thought we were making some progress. So I think it's useful to have that context, but I do think faith has certainly been emphasised a lot more in recent time, and particularly in the global context, Islam and its role in global matters as much as community issues in cities like London.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because that's all time we've got for this discussion, but do come back after the break and join us for the second part of the Politics and Media programme.